Hello, Michael. Where do thoughts arise from?
The simple answer is just one word. They arise from you. That is, they cannot arise from anything other than ourselves, because we alone are what actually exists. So ultimately, whatever arises must arise from us. That is the simple answer. But we can analyze a bit deeper. That is, all thoughts can be divided into subject and objects. Subject is one, objects are many. All thoughts are objects except for the first thought. The first thought is what Bhagavan often referred to as the thought called I, or as ego. That first thought is the confused awareness, the conflated awareness, I am this body. That is pure awareness, is aware of itself as just I am. But when we rise as ego, we're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So that's the nature of the subject. All other thoughts are jada. That means they're not aware. So they seem to exist only in the view of the subject, the first thought, namely ego. So the first thought to arise, as Bhagavan said, is ego. Ego rises from ourself. All other thoughts arise from ego. So we first rise as ego, and then from us, other thoughts rise. From us as ego, other thoughts rise. So from our real nature, from what we actually are, from Atma-vichara, we rise as ego. And then from us as ego, all other thoughts rise. That's one way of going into it deeper. There's another point to understand. Why do thoughts rise from us? People often say, "Oh, thoughts just come. I have no control over what thoughts come." That is, it may seem like that to some people whose minds are very outward looking. They may not see the cause for the rising of thoughts. But if we go deep in the practice of self-investigation, it is very clear to us, whatever thoughts rise, they are just the sprouting of our vasanas. Vasanas means our inclinations. So we think thoughts because we're inclined to think them. They don't just pop up randomly. Whatever thoughts appear, they appear because we have an inclination to think them. And we need to understand in this context, when Bhagavan talks about thoughts, according to Bhagavan, all objects, all phenomena are just thoughts. Even the subject, as I said, is just a thought, that ego. So whatever appears is just a thought. Whatever appears and disappears is just a thought. The first thing to appear is ego. And when ego disappears, when ego subsides, everything else subsides. Why? Because everything else, all other thoughts, all phenomena, appear only in the view of ourself as ego. When we don't rise as ego, nothing else rises. So in summary, first we rise as ego. We rise as ego from where? Only from what we actually are. That is, in sleep, for example. In sleep, there are no thoughts, because there's no ego. So what exists in sleep is only ourself. That is ourself as we actually are, as the pure awareness I am. Nothing other than I am exists in sleep. From I am, which is what we actually are, we rise as I am Ernesto, I am Carlos, I am Michael. That adjunct mixed awareness is what is called ego. Only from ego do all other thoughts rise. So the person we seem to be, the person we mistake ourselves to be, the body we mistake ourselves to be, is just a thought or a series of thoughts. So we rise as ego, immediately we project, the first thought we project, the first objective thought we project is the thought of a body. We experience that body as ourself, and through the five senses of that body, we project the material world. And seemingly within that body, that's within the mind, which seems to be within the body, we experience so many other thoughts. We experience perceptions, memories, emotions, and so on, all different types of thoughts. But actually, though it seems that the mind is within the body, actually the whole universe is within the mind.
Yes. I usually listen an idea that I think that is a confusion, no? At the light of what you are explaining now, no? That is the thoughts comes from the self, from what we really are, no?
Yes.
I think that this confusion is based in the idea that how the ego, when you see the ego directly, really there is no ego, only there is the consciousness.
Yes.
This consciousness is what we really are, and from this point of view, the thoughts comes from the consciousness, right, and right. This is an misunderstanding, no?
Yes. This is a very common misunderstanding. Yes, it is true. Bhagavan has said ego is not real. If we investigate it, we find there's no such thing as ego. But he's also said, if ego comes into existence, here comes into existence, doesn't mean that it actually exists. It seemingly comes into existence. Whatever comes into existence and ceases to exist, whatever does not exist permanently, doesn't actually exist according to Bhagavan. If something actually exists, it must always exist. Bhagavan used to say, if something exists at one time and not at another time, it doesn't actually exist even when it seems to exist. So whatever comes into existence is only it's only a seeming existence. So ego doesn't actually exist, but it seems to exist. And then Bhagavan says, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. This is what Bhagavan teaches us in verse 26 of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu. Therefore, ego itself is everything. People who say, oh, ego doesn't exist, then where do thoughts come from? They come only from Atma-vichara. Then they have misunderstood what Bhagavan is saying. Bhagavan says very clearly, the same teaching he expresses in different words. For example, in many places he said this, but for example, in the 5th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, he says, of all the thoughts that rise in the mind, the thought called I is the first thought. Only after this rises do all other thoughts rise. What he refers to there as the thought called I is ego. So it's true, ego doesn't exist. But if ego doesn't exist, everything else doesn't exist. So long as other things seem to exist, ego seems to exist. In the Upanishads, in various places, I think in the Chandogya Upanishad and also in the Mandukya Upanishad, it is said, all this is Brahman. That is true in a certain sense, but Bhagavan has given us a deeper and subtler analysis. As I say in verse 26 of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, Bhagavan says, Ahandeya yavamam, ego itself is everything. But why do they say in the Upanishads, Brahman, everything is Brahman, and Bhagavan says ego is everything? Bhagavan is clarifying what is meant in the Upanishads. That is, all other things seem to exist only in the view of ego. Only when we rise as ego do other things seem to exist. So when we see any phenomena of any kind, whether seemingly physical phenomena or mental phenomena of any kind whatsoever, that is, we as ego are seeing ourselves as that phenomena. No, phenomena do not exist independent of ego. That is, they borrow their seeming existence from the seeming existence of ourself as ego. So that is why Bhagavan says ego itself is everything. That is, ego is the substance that appears as all this. Like if you've got many gold ornaments, you may have bracelets and bangles and rings and necklaces and tiaras and crowns and all sorts of gold ornaments you may have. They are all gold. The substance is gold. It's just different forms assumed by one substance. So the substance that appears as all these names and forms is only ego. But what is ego? If we investigate ego, we find that ego is nothing but pure awareness, which is what is otherwise called Brahman.
But only when you investigate that.
Only when, well, we are always Brahman. Even now, Brahman alone exists. Yes. But from a perspective of ego, it seems like all these other things exist. So the non-existence of ego can be experienced by ego only when it investigates itself. When ego investigates itself keenly enough, it will experience itself as pure awareness. But as soon as ego experiences itself as pure awareness, it is no longer ego. It ceases to be ego. Because ego is nothing but the mixed awareness, I am this person. So when we turn our attention keenly within, the adjuncts drop off and pure awareness alone remains. When we as ego experience ourselves as pure awareness, ego is destroyed. That is manonasa, eradication of ego. And then it's true, everything is Brahman. That is, there is no everything then. But what is it that appeared as ego was only Brahman. What is it that appears as everything else is only ego. So ultimately, everything is only Brahman. But the Bhagavan's teachings are very, very practical. So Bhagavan, why Bhagavan emphasized that everything is ego, rather than everything is Brahman? Because if everything is Brahman, then how do we get rid of everything? We can't get rid of Brahman because Brahman alone is what actually exists. But if everything is Brahman, if everything is ego, and ego is just a false awareness of ourselves, if we investigate ego, ego will cease to exist and everything else will cease to exist along with it. So Maya, samsara, karma, all the heavens and hells, all the innumerable worlds, everything seems to exist only in the view of ego. If we investigate ego and find that ego is just pure awareness, then nothing else exists. That's why the ultimate truth is ajata. But we shouldn't try to apply ajata in our present state, because in our present state, our present experience directly contradicts ajata. According to ajata, nothing has ever appeared, nothing has ever arisen. But our present experience is, I have arisen as ego, and all this has arisen in front of me. I'm seeing all this. So ajata is the truth. It is the ultimate truth. But from the perspective of ego, all this seems to exist. So so this is not real. None of this is real. It's all just an appearance. But how to get rid of this appearance? This appearance appears to whom? This is the very powerful question Bhagavan gave us. To whom does it appear? To whom does Maya appear? To whom does samsara appear? To whom do all these problems appear? To whom does COVID appear? To whom does birth and death appear? Only to ego. If we investigate ego and find out what we actually are, ego will cease to exist and everything else will cease to exist along with it. Even to say it will cease to exist is true only from our present perspective, because when we find we are pure awareness, we will know that we were always pure awareness and nothing had ever appeared. So since nothing had ever appeared, it cannot disappear. It cannot cease to, nothing had ever come into existence. It cannot cease to exist. But from the perspective of ego, we have to say it will all cease to exist.
Yes, no, I think that's some of the best bondage, of Bhagavan's teachings.
Yes. Yeah.
is this including of all the perspectives, no?
Yeah.
And how to see clear for what perspectives is the ideal, no? And too many people. I'm now thinking in you, Michael. Sometimes, some people tell me, you appear like a Advaitic policeman, no? Because we are correcting, sometimes, the thoughts come from come from the self, come from the ego, no?
Yes.
Or from the ajata perspective, we can say too that the thoughts doesn't come from anywhere. Because
they don't come at all.
Because there is an illusion, no? An illusion.
Even there's no illusion, because an illusion is a false appearance. To whom does an illusion appear? It appears only to ego. If there's no ego, there's no illusion.
Yes.
So in ajata, there's not even illusion.
Yes.
One more thing I'd like to say in this context, it is Bhagavan's teachings are the essence of Advaita. They're also that is what is unique about Bhagavan's teachings, is he has highlighted the practical implications of Advaita. A lot of Advaita philosophy, if you read, it's unnecessarily complicated. Bhagavan has presented Advaita in its simplest and clearest form, and also most practical form. So, taking Bhagavan's teachings as the pure Advaita, the true Advaita, Advaita in its essence, Bhagavan's teachings are extremely simple, but they're also very deep and very subtle. So it's easy to read Bhagavan's teachings superficially and come to wrong conclusions. Like this wrong conclusion people come to. Oh, Bhagavan says there's no ego. Therefore, they try and remove ego from Bhagavan's teachings. The whole of Bhagavan's teachings is based on ego. Bhagavan begins Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu by saying, Nām Ullahum Kandalal, because we see the world. The first word is we. In Tamil, we comes first. We, the world, because see, is the order of words in Tamil. So the very first word in the main text, I'm not talking about the Mangalam verses, in the main text, Bhagavan begins with the word we. To whom does that word we refer in that context? In other contexts, Bhagavan used we to refer to our real nature, but in that context, he's referring to ego. Because to whom does who is seeing the world? To whom does the world appear? Only to ego. So Bhagavan begins Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu by referring to ego. And in so many verses, either explicitly or implicitly, he's referring to ego. Because ego is the root of all the problems. So Bhagavan does say ego doesn't exist, but his teachings are based on the fact that ego seems to exist. And only when ego seems to exist do all other things seem to exist. So long as we're aware of anything other than ourselves, any other thoughts, we cannot deny the seeming existence of ego. Yes. Other things seem to exist because we seem to be ego.
Okay, thank you very much.
We need a very, it's not difficult to understand Bhagavan teachings. It's incredibly simple, but we need to read them deeply and carefully, and most importantly, we need to apply them in practice, because the real clarity, we can get a certain understanding from reading the words, but the words are pointers. They're pointing at something which is beyond words. So the real clarity comes only by following Bhagavan's teaching, by putting them into practice. The more we put them into practice by turning within, the clearer and simpler all these things will become. I mean, the more blindingly obvious it will be the truth of what Bhagavan is saying. Mm-hmm. And it's very simple and very coherent. So there won't be room for misunderstandings if we apply them in practice and go deep in the practice. all the misunderstandings arise only when we consider them superficially and fail to go deep in the practice. And understanding Bhagavan teachings correctly is very important. That is, we cannot know ourselves by understanding, but that understanding is necessary in order for us to follow this path. If we don't understand Bhagavan teachings correctly, we won't be able to apply them correctly. So a clear understanding is necessary. So we need to read them, that's Sravana, and consider them, think deeply about them, manana. But most important of all, we need to put them into practice. That is nididhyasana.
Yes, Carlos write something in the chat.
Yes.
He say, when we look at ego, there is no ego to be found. Obviously, we're not talking about an entity or an object, but the subject.
Yes.
However, we are aware there is no ego, but at the same time, there is no realization upon close inspection. Can you clarify that?
That is, ego. Are we aware that ego doesn't exist? So long as we are looking at anything other than ourselves, even to a slightest extent, we who are looking at that other thing, we who are attending to that other thing, we who are aware of that other thing, are ego. So ego seems to exist so long as we look at anything other than ourselves. When we look at ourselves keenly enough, we will find we are just pure awareness. Only when we experience ourselves as pure awareness will it be very clear that there is no such thing as ego. Pure awareness means awareness that is not aware of anything other than itself. In other words, just that mere awareness I am, that is pure awareness. So long as there's the slightest awareness of anything other than ourselves, that which is aware of that other thing, that to which that other thing appears, is only ego. So when we are trying to practice self-investigation, we look within, trying to find what is this ego? To tell the truth, we are not even looking for ego. We are looking for the reality of ego, what ego actually is. Or as Bhagavan often said, the source of ego, the place from which ego rises. The place from which ego rises, it means ourself. It's the reality of ego. It's just different ways of expressing the same thing.
And we can difference, no? The ego arises from the self.
Yes.
That arises on the self, no?
Ego arises from the self, in the self. It's the self, as you call it, that is Atma-vichara, what we actually are, alone exists. So ego cannot come out of that, but Bhagavan sometimes metaphorically says, when the mind comes out from Atma-vichara, obviously the mind cannot come out from Atma-vichara because Atma-vichara is the infinite whole. It's a metaphorical way of saying it. When we rise up, when we rise as ego, we seem to have come out of Atma-vichara. Because we're no longer aware of ourselves as we actually are.
I say this because how the ego is a phantom without form.
Yes.
And he take the properties of a consciousness,
yes.
To live itself as a body,
yes.
fabrication a body,
yes.
is like a shadow, that appears on the sun. But when you see this cloud,
yes.
You very, very keenly, the cloud disappear and only
yes.
is the sun,
Yes, yes.
But meanwhile, its cloud appears to exist,
Yes.
Is something that appears on, not come from the sun, because the sun never can extract this phantom,
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, we can say, we can explain these things in different ways. The truth is, this is all Maya. The rising of ego. Maya is nothing but ego. So the rising of ego is itself Maya. So we cannot adequately, we we can try and explain it using analogies, using words, but no words can capture it correctly.
Yeah.
Maya is said to be anivachaniya. It's inexpressible. Why is it inexpressible? Because it doesn't actually exist. But unfortunately, it seems to exist now. So our aim isn't that we need understanding in order to follow this path. But we shouldn't think that within our little intellect, we can grasp all of this. We can never grasp it. When we follow we need the understanding in order to apply it in practice. We apply it in practice by turning within. When we turn within, there is the ego dissolved along with everything else. So there's nothing left to understand and no one left to understand it. But so long as we have risen as ego, we need a clear understanding in order to find our way back home. So we need to understand what we can understand and what we should understand. We shouldn't try to understand things that really are not understandable, because how can you ever understand what doesn't exist? That is, Bhagavan said, Maya is ya-ma, what is not. So Maya doesn't actually exist. And ego is nothing but Maya. And everything seen by ego is nothing but Maya. So we cannot and need not understand all this. What Bhagavan has given us is the basic principles that we need to understand in order to apply this in practice. We are not here to explain Maya, because Maya is inexplicable, because it doesn't exist. What we are here is to investigate that Maya is nothing but ego. So who am I? In whose view all these things that seem to exist? Investigate ourselves and the problem is solved.
Yes. Only approximations, no?
Yes, it's the approximation.
Signals, or pointers. Or,
yes. So we can say ego arises from Atma-swarupa, in Atma-swarupa. We can't say by Atma-swarupa, because that would be misleading, because Atma-swarupa isn't doing anything. But all other thoughts, we can say they arise from ego, they arise to ego, they arise in ego, they arise by ego.
Yes.
So ego is the culprit. Just get rid of this ego and the whole problems are solved. That is the whole essence of Bhagavan's teachings.
What we need to drop off.
Yes, yes. We ourselves have a problem. And what is the solution to this problem? We ourselves have a solution. By being aware of ourselves as something other than what we actually are, all these problems have arisen. By being aware of ourselves as we actually are, all these problems will be solved.